Folks, Black Star Network is here.
Hold no punches!
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig? Today is Monday, June 10th, 2024. Coming up on Roland Martin Unfiltered, streaming live on the Black Star Network. One of our greatest civil rights leaders is now an ancestor. The Reverend James Lawson Jr. passed away today in Los Angeles at the age of 95. We'll take a look back at his phenomenal life. He is an extraordinary figure, an architect, the architect of the Nashville movement, a man who believed in the Gandhi principles of nonviolence, that he actually went to prison for refusing to enter the draft to go to war. He also was the man who called Dr. King to come to Memphis to stand with sanitation workers. We'll talk to folks who knew him. We'll also hear from him in several interviews that I conducted with him over the last several years. Folks, it is time to bring the funk. I'm Roland Martin Unfiltered, the Black Star Network. Let's go.
He's got it. Whatever the miss, he's on it. Whatever it is, he's got the scoop, the fact, the find. And when it breaks, he's right on time and it's rolling. Best believe he's knowing. Putting it down from sports to news to politics. With entertainment just for kicks, he's rolling. It's on go, roll, roll, y'all. It's Roland Martin, yeah.
Folks, I'm here in Atlanta participating in the War Done Celebrity Golf Tournament, and literally as we were coming off of the course, I got a text message with regards to the passing of the Reverend James Lawson Jr. His family announced that he died of cardiac arrest in Los Angeles at his home there. He was 95 years old. Dr. Lawson was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, but he really became known for being the architect of what is called the Nashville movement. That, of course, is the movement that trained many civil rights workers, including John Lewis, Diane Nash, C.T. Vivian, and so many others. He also, of course, worked alongside Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was Lawson who was working in Memphis, who was the one who the sanitation workers tasked to call Dr. King to come to Memphis to stand with him. He was an extraordinary figure. He later relocated to Los Angeles, where he pastored a church there in Los Angeles. The thing that was so amazing about Reverend Lawson is that he was not trying to become a civil rights entertainer. He was not someone who was on the circuit, who showed up at awards and dinners to be praised. In fact, he was someone who preferred not to be seen, not to be heard, because he was all about the work. In a conversation I had with him, we talked about that. He also said that his last image, he said, my last image of Martin was him standing in the pulpit at Mason Temple and me sitting on the last pew in the church. He said Martin was where he was supposed to be, and I was where I was supposed to be. Even folks in later ages, he was an extremely sharp figure, strong mentally, who really had solid thoughts as it related to Black Lives Matter, as it relates to organizing and movement building. Reverend Lawson was that kind of figure. And if you want to understand someone who was egoless, I remember moderating a session at Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, AOC. And it was a session with Dr. Harry Edwards, other officials of the NFL. We were talking about Colin Kaepernick in protest. And one of the, so a gentleman stopped me, actually, the president of Alpha Phi Alpha, told me, he said, hey, we're about to leave. He said, I'm here with Dr. Lawson. And I said, I'm sorry, what do you mean you're here with Dr. Lawson? He said, yeah, Jim Lawson. He's over there in the corner. And so I looked to my right, and literally, sitting in a corner was Reverend Jim Lawson, listening to the conversation. And they were leaving. And I said, no, Doc, you can't leave. You can't leave without speaking to this crowd. I'm always one where I say, look, don't give folk the microphone. I'll hold it myself. And I said to the audience, here's one individual who I will gladly hand the microphone over to because I wanted the folk in the room to know who he was. And again, did not come in with any fanfare. Didn't have folks all around him. Didn't have assistants scurrying. He didn't demand a seat on the front row. He was literally sitting in the corner in the back, listening and watching the conversation. And so I had him speak. A couple of years later, we went to Los Angeles, and I wanted to interview Dr. Lawson. And he didn't want to do it at first. Again, he was not somebody who sought the limelight, but he agreed to do it. We were preparing for MLK 50, and we were doing interviews with a variety of individuals regarding the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Well, when it was time to actually start editing, I discovered the folks at TV One lost the interview. They literally couldn't find it. I was beyond angry. I was pissed with what happened. We didn't have it for 2018. But later that year, I was working on an election special. We're in Los Angeles shooting the special, the Be Woke Vote. And I was telling them about what happened. And then I said, well, hell, let me just call Dr. Lawson. So I called him. And it took some convincing. I pleaded with him. I said, Dr. Lawson, your voice is really important. I said, all this would do is take an hour. We will pick you up. We'll do the interview in an hour, and then we'll take you right back home. Then he said, what time? When he came there, let me tell you, folks, it was an extraordinary interview. And when we finished, no one moved. No one said a word. And then the entire production crew began to clap. All because of what this man had to say. A few weeks ago, at the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and I remarked to some White House officials that I really wish that they had awarded him the Medal of Freedom. And I said, I really hope Dr. Lawson can be given this award next year. And then we got the word today that he had passed away. That conversation I had with him, you will see in the next hour. It is extraordinary dialogue. This man was so amazing. And he believed in nonviolence so much that when he was in seminary, he could have gotten a waiver not to go into the war because he was in seminary. But Reverend Lawson believed in nonviolence so much. He said he was such a pacifist that he chose to go to federal prison instead of using that waiver to get out of going to war. Extraordinary. Too many people don't know who he is. Too many people don't realize the work that he put in. But today we absolutely lost one of our greatest civil rights leaders, one of our greatest organizers and tacticians ever. A few weeks ago, he joined Mark Thompson on his show to talk about the war between Israel and what's happening in Gaza. Reverend Mark Thompson joins us right now. Mark, glad to have you on the show. He was 95 years old, but that brother was still sharp of mind with tremendous insight on present-day issues.
Most certainly was, and thank you, Roland, for this tribute. As always, you are covering what we need you to cover, because this is a sacred day. James Lawson, if Dr. King was our modern-day Jesus, then James Lawson was our modern-day John the Baptist. He went to India before Dr. King. He did a lot of things before Dr. King, with Dr. King's full knowledge, to go and kind of make way for the one who would follow. He went to India. He studied Gandhi. Dr. King followed him there 2 years later. As you mentioned, he went to jail as a conscientious objector. He was an absolute, uncompromising proponent of nonviolent civil disobedience. So much so as we all were celebrating the Montgomery brawl, James Lawson chastised us. He said any type of violence that we exhibit is wrong. He was truly a believer in the nonviolent principles. He knew me before I was born, because he was in Nashville, in the church where my family worshiped, but my mother was still in high school, teaching John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, Diane Nash, and Marion Barry, all students at Tennessee State, Fisk and Meharry, and American Baptist College, all of those students, the principles of nonviolent resistance, so that they could go downtown in 1960 and turn Nashville upside down and desegregate those lunch counters. And that was the first successful desegregation sit-in movement in the South at that time. He got that ball rolling. And so he truly was a giant. And you're right, he stayed sharp. He was sharp. one of the most important things we did, you mentioned the war just now, we did the ceasefire music video. Dr. Lawson never been in music. I don't do music videos. It's Dr. Lawson, why don't you do a music video? Let's do this music video. And I convinced him to do it, and he did it. And we got to have him on camera with all these other voices. And to me, his voice and his presence was the most validating because of his uncompromising position when it came to nonviolence. He was in Memphis when he left Nashville, organizing Memphis. Again, first there, John the Baptist, there with Bill Lucy, and invited Dr. King to Memphis. A lot of people forget that Memphis was a labor struggle. It was an AFSCME struggle. The brothers, the sanitation workers, wanted a union. So for sanitation, most of us don't even know who a sanitation worker is, don't even speak to them. The lowliest of the low, they handle our rubbish. And James Lawson and Dr. King were concerned about them. And he believed that he was going to be killed in Memphis, as many others felt that they were going to be killed. And of course, we know that Dr. King became that martyr in Memphis, something that I know James Lawson never got over. But he continued the work up until Dr. King should have lived to be his age as well. He was taken from us. But he lived to be almost 100 still doing this work. So for those who've not heard of him, for those who are just hearing us talk about him for the first time and hearing his name for the first time all over the news today, run to Google him, run to read about him and share his story with the children. Dr. King if Dr. King were here, he would mourn and praise the life of James Lawson himself.
Here's one of the things. So when I talked to him, Mark, he said something to me that it was and I keep using the word extraordinary, and I'm doing so for a reason. He said to me, they spent 6 months talking about why they wanted to launch a movement. Then he said they spent 6 months discussing what they wanted to do. That's a year. Today, we'll call a meeting, and by the end of the meeting, we got an Instagram page, a website, we got a Zelle, PayPal, Venmo already created. And so what he was talking about was having this deep understanding of a commitment to movement building.
And discipline and knowledge, because they studied. They read the scripture, they understood and learned from the successes of the past and the mistakes of the past. We don't do them. We don't read like we should. A lot of us don't. And we do just kind of jump out here. Now, there's a convenience and an expeditiousness to being able to jump out there and have the Instagram accounts and the social media accounts. But they had none of that. Marcus Garvey had 6 million members in his organization, and there was no social media, no internet. So it just shows what we were able to do. And to your point, Roland, we can run out here and do something quickly nowadays with social media helping us. But is it as effective as what they did when they did not have those resources? Can we boycott riding the bus for 400 days, but we have social media now? You know, can we go to the lunch counters and be beaten and not retaliate, even though we have social media? If the sanitation work, the people who pick up our trash, the regular everyday people who make this little red wagon of America go, if they need us, can we drop what we're doing and organize a boycott and a march that is effective and wins their rights? But we have social media. So this was the power that he had. And as I said, it was a little embarrassing. You know, he came on the show right after the Montgomery brawl. And I wanted to ask him how he felt. First, I called him. I said, black folk fought back, jumped off the ferry, whipped the white folks with chair. We all wearing chair necklaces and earrings. So how you feel about that, Dr. Lawson? And some very prominent leaders in our civil rights movement disagreed with James Lawson for what he said. He said, no, nonviolence is the only answer. He didn't support it. I said, even in this face of self-defense, he said no because he taught that the greatest self-defense was what Jesus taught, and that is to turn the other cheek. Unless it was in the case of something where one's life was in jeopardy and one had to save one's life. But then even he said it was not for the purpose of taking another life. You're right, his humility was legendary. Never had an entourage. Always sat in the back of the room. You kind of had to cajole him to the front and cajole him to the mic. And I think a lot of that humility had to do with his relationship with Dr. King and his service to Dr. King. You know, Dr. King was the same way. He was a very humble man. Very, very humble man. He could be in the room with folks like Mukasa Willie Ricks and others, and even at times Kwame Ture, calling him an Uncle Tom to his face. And Dr. King wouldn't even get upset. He'd still have them walk right beside him all the way from Sumner, Montgomery, saying, you know, Dr. King's acting like an Uncle Tom because of what we did in Selma. We had a turnaround Tuesday. And Dr. King would still stand with those people. He couldn't hurt him. You couldn't hurt James Lawson either. No weapon formed against him could ever prosper, and it never did.
Joining us right now is Tennessee State Representative Justin Jones, who represents Nashville. Representative Jones, always glad to have you back on the show. Reverend James Lawson was fired, kicked out at Vanderbilt because of his civil rights work. He was later, years later, decades later, honored by them as a result of that. The Nashville movement does not get the attention that it rightly deserves. Obviously, people talk about the important work of Dr. King, but then you hear people talk about John Lewis and Diane Dash and C.T. Vivian and James Bevel and others, but they all went through the training of Reverend Jim Lawson. That's how huge of a figure he was.
I mean, you know, another word I would use to describe Reverend Lawson is intergenerational. Just in April, myself, Ms. Nash, and Reverend Lawson did a panel here in Nashville honoring the anniversary of Nashville becoming the first Southern city to desegregate its lunch counters, and that was because of the brilliance, the strategy, the tactics of Reverend James Lawson. And I called Ms. Nash. That was the first person I called after I heard the news, and just spent about an hour talking about his role, his witness, his example in our lives. A lot of people don't realize that right after I was expelled last year, Reverend Lawson was one of the people who reached out and immediately, you know, said, we want to support you. We have this fellowship with this interfaith organization that we want to support you with so that you will be okay. And as somebody, even as I was a student at Vanderbilt dealing with a school that proclaimed one thing and acted another way, he's somebody who showed up and who spoke up and who helped guide me through that journey there. And so we don't honor Reverend Lawson enough. He definitely should have, you know, was long overdue to get a Presidential Medal of Freedom. Nashville must continue to uplift him because he's the reason why Dr. King came to Nashville and said, I came to Nashville not to bring inspiration, but to get inspiration from the movement that's happening here. And that movement was made possible by Reverend James Lawson, who in 1959 began training students at Fisk and Tennessee A&I and Meharry and American Baptist College in this life work of nonviolence. And even the civil rights movement, what we call the civil rights movement, Reverend Lawson said that it was not the civil rights movement because that makes it seem like it's finished. He called it the nonviolence movement in America and talked about how it continues today in challenging racism and sexism and militarism and what he termed plantation capitalism. And so that's how we honor his work, by continuing the struggle to which he gave his life, continuing to commit our lives, our hearts, our minds, our physical strength, our energy to those movements to dismantle the wickedness that he called out. And he really showed us that faith and justice are inseparable. And so that's how we honor the Reverend James Lawson as a new rising generation who's continuing that tradition, that legacy, that lineage of nonviolence as a form of resistance to evil that we see in our time right now.
He was not someone who was also shy to speak his tongue. You heard Mark say there where he disagreed with how people reacted to the Montgomery brawl. I remember asking him, talking to him about Black Lives Matter, and he said that he had some advice for them as to how they were supposed to operate moving forward. So he was never shy about speaking his truth.
No, he wasn't. And I'm sorry, Justin, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Oh, no, you go ahead, Mark. I was just going to say, I mean, that's absolutely true. I remember in 2020 when we were having protests in Nashville, and I talked to him about it. He went through a whole strategy conversation as to, what is the purpose of the protest? Is blocking streets getting people on your side? What is a more strategic way to bring more people to join you? What is the long-term vision? What is the goal, the clear, objectives of the movement? Like, he was very clear and very concise, and that's why he was an amazing teacher, a professor in this University of Nonviolence who really made us question and think about not just what was a flash in the pan moment, but how do we build a movement that sustains? And he also wasn't shy to call out power. I remember in Nashville when we named the street after John Lewis, he spoke at that anniversary, and it was a room full of politicians, and he asked our governor, does our governor have a hole in his soul, by the policies he's uplifting that are hurting people, Black people, workers, young people in our state in Tennessee. And so Reverend Lawson was somebody who had moral clarity and who was very committed and clear in what he believed and what he was sharing with us as an intergenerational, interfaith rising movement, challenging those systems that he called out. And making America live up to what it said in the Constitution. He was very clear in lifting up the language from the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, that he believed were promises that were never fulfilled, that we had to live and breathe life into here in this nation.
And I just wanted to add, Roland, to build
go ahead.
On Justin's point of him being intergenerational, really transgenerational. You look at this young man, and that's not, that's specific. When he was in Clark Memorial United Methodist Church in Nashville, teaching John Lewis and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and Marion Barry and others, my mother was there. She was in high school. 6 years later, I was born. I'm in that same church. 35 years later, maybe 40, Justin Jones is in Clark Memorial United Methodist Church. So here you have at least 3 or 4 generations of people in the same space whose lives have been touched and influenced by James Lawson. He was always relevant. And it's so important that Justin is here because we all know what Justin represents. He is this current generation of young people that we want to see pick up this torch and carry it. And for James Lawson to have touched him so personally and so closely, and for him to have drank from the cup of James Lawson's teaching and sat at his feet, we have a lot of hope for him, and we have a lot of hope for the generation that Justin is leading. And so we are so thankful for the life of James Lawson and the influence he's had on all these generations.
Representative Jones, final comment.
I think we're going to hear a lot of politicians, a lot of people talking about how they loved Reverend Lawson and lifting up his story. But I think the way that we honor him is by continuing his fight. And so any politician, anybody you hear talking about how much they love, even pastors in these churches, how much they love Reverend Lawson these next few days, let us honor him through action. Let us honor him through continuing to struggle. Let us honor him by continuing to sacrifice. He spent months in prison. I mean, I think the most amazing thing about Reverend Lawson is that he lived to be 95, because even though he faced death today, he's faced death many times. He stared it in his eyes and did not turn back, did not back down. And so let's make sure that when people lift up the words of his life, let's make sure that they honor those words by breathing life of action into fighting for policy change and to change this nation. And that's how we honor the life, the legacy, the lineage, the light of this great giant of the movement who's left us today, but whose teachings will never leave us.
Representative Justin Jones, we surely appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Reverend Mark Thompson, we appreciate it. Thanks as well. God bless. Right back, folks, as we pay tribute to the life and legacy of the Reverend James Lawson Jr., who passed away this morning at the age of 95. You're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered of the Black Star Network.
Hello, my brothers and sisters. This is Bishop William J. Barber II, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and president of Repairs of the Breach. And I'm calling on you to get everybody you know to join us on Saturday, June 29th at 10 o'clock a.m. in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania and 3rd for the mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the polls, and the post effort to reach 15 million poor and low-wage infrequent voters who, if they vote, can change the outcome of our politics in this country.
Our goal is to center the desires and the political policy agenda of poor and low-wage persons, along with moral religious leaders and advocates. Too often, poor and low-wage people are not talked about, even though in this country today there are 135 million poor and low-wage persons. There's not a state in this country now where poor and low-wage persons do not make up at least 30% of the electorate.
It is time that the issues of poor and low-wage people be at the center of our politics. Living wages, health care, things that matter in the everyday lives. We will no longer allow poverty to be the fourth leading cause of death in this country. We must let our voices be heard. Join us. Go to our website, www.poorpeoplescampaign.org. RSVP. Get others to come. Get a bus. Get a van. Get on the train. Come and let our voices be heard and our votes be felt. Lift from the bottom so that everybody rises.
Hey, what's up, y'all? I'm Devon Frank.
I'm Dr. Robin B., pharmacist and fitness coach, and you're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered.
Folks, this morning, the news came out of the passing of Reverend James Lawson Jr., the age of 95. His family announced his passing to the world. So many people have been talking about him, what he meant, how amazing a figure that he was. Before I go to my next guest, Reverend Lawson gave a eulogy at the funeral of John Lewis. I want to play a little bit of that. I'm going to play the rest later. Many people talk about the eulogy that President Barack Obama delivered at that funeral, which was good. It was very good. But the eulogy that was truly preached at the funeral of Congressman John Lewis was done by his teacher, Reverend Dr. James Lawson.
Pastor, sisters and brothers, members of this Lewis family that so wonderfully nurtured John in love, and hope, and courage, and faith, and the rest of it. And sisters and brothers, Czesław Miłosz, a Polish Catholic poet, sets the tone, at least in part for me, as John Lewis has journeyed from the eternity of this extraordinary, mysterious human race into the eternity that none of us know very much about. When he wrote this poem called Meaning, when I die, I will see the lining of the world, the other side, beyond bird, mountain, sunset. The true meaning ready to be decoded. What never added up will now add up. What was incomprehensible will become comprehended. And if there is no lining to the world, if a thrush on a branch is not a sign, but just a thrush on a branch, if night and day make no sense following each other, and on this earth there is nothing but the earth, even if that is so, there will remain a word, wakened by the lips that perish, a tireless messenger who runs and runs through interstellar places, through revolving galaxies, and calls out and protests and screams. And I submit that John in that other eternity will be heard by us again and again, running through the galaxies, still proclaiming that we, the people of the USA, can one day live up to the full meaning of we hold these truths. Live up to the full meaning, we, the people of the USA, in order to perfect a more perfect union. John Lewis practiced not the politics that we call bipartisan. John Lewis practiced the politics that we, the people of the U.S., need more desperately than ever before, the politics of the Declaration of Independence, the politics of the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. I've read many of the so-called civil rights books of the last 50 or 60 years about the period between 1953 and 1973. Most of the books are wrong about John Lewis. Most of the books are wrong about how John got engaged in the Nashville campaign of 1959-60. This is the 60th year of the sit-in campaign, which swept into every state of the Union, largely manned by students because we recruited students, but put upon the map that the nonviolent struggle begun in Montgomery, Alabama, was not an accident, but as Martin King Jr. called it, Christian love has power that we have never tapped, and if we use it, we can transform not only our own lives, but we will transform the earth in which we live. I count it providential that as I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, dropping out of graduate school, in Nashville came people like Kelly Miller Smith and Andrew White and Janetta Hayes and Helen Roberts and Dolores Wilkerson, and John Lewis, Diane Nash, C.T. Vivian, Marion Barry, Jim Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, Paulina Knight, Angela Butler. How all of us gathered in 1958 and 59 and 60 and 61 and 62 in the same city at the same time, I count as being providential. We did not plan it. We were all led there. And when Kelly Miller Smith and the Nashville Christian Leadership Council met in the fall of 1958, and we determined that if there's to be a second major campaign that will demonstrate the efficacy of satyagraha, of soul force, of love truth, that we would have to do it in Nashville. And so I planned, as the strategist and organizer, a 4-point Gandhian strategic program to create the campaign. We decided with great fear and anticipation we would desegregate downtown Nashville. No group of black people or other people anywhere in the United States in the 20th century against the rapaciousness of a segregated system ever thought about desegregating downtown, tearing down the signs, renovating the waiting rooms, taking the immoral signs off of drinking fountains. But it was black women who made that decision for us in Nashville. I was scared to death when we made that decision. I knew nothing about how we were going to do this. I had never done it before. But we planned the strategy. John Lewis did not stumble in on that campaign. Kelly Miller Smith, his teacher at ABC, invited John to join the workshops in the fall of 1959 as we prepared ourselves to face violence and to do direct action and to put on the map the issue that the racism and the segregation of the nation had to end. And so in the 60th anniversary of that sit-in campaign, which became the second major campaign of the nonviolent movement of America. Those are not my words. John Lewis called what we did between 1953 and 1973 the nonviolent movement of America, not the CRM. I think we need to get the story straight because words are powerful. History must be written in such a fashion that it lifts up truly the spirit of the John Lewises of the world.
Folks, we're going to play the rest of that eulogy. Absolutely powerful. Listening to Reverend Jim Lawson. Joining us right now is someone who was trained in the Jim Lawson Institute, activist, labor leader, Tiffany Lofton. Tiffany, glad to have you back on the show. Just for folks who, and again, I see this all the time, he did the limelight. He wasn't trying to show up at all the events and getting pats on the back and wait. He was not. That's not who he was. So talk about interactions with him, but also the teaching principles that he was all about when it came to mobilizing and organizing.
Roland, watching that clip you just played was really emotional. And I am sitting with this deep appreciation for the time that I get to live, and how honored I was to have crossed paths and sat at the feet of Reverend James Lawson twice. In 2018, when I was accepted, that's a funny story, I applied to the James Lawson Institute and I didn't get accepted, but they said they would hold my application for the next one. And then I got into the next one, which was incredible, where I flew down to Nashville, Tennessee in March of 2018. And I was with a cohort of, I think it was like 20 to 25 other indigenous artists and organizers, Black and brown folks from across the country, who came to learn and study nonviolence as a form of revolutionary resistance. And at the time, I was working in the labor movement, but I was working with other organizations that folks know, like the Dream Defenders in Florida. I had just helped start the Ohio Student Association in Ohio. I just came from being the president of the United States Student Association, and I said, well, I want to learn from my elders. And, you know, Roland, you know, I was in LA, K through 12. I did not learn who James Lawson was in school. So it wasn't until I moved to DC and met some peers in the labor movement and in organizing that I found out who John Lewis was, that I found out who James Lawson was. And I'll never forget hearing his voice and seeing him at the panel after the March on Washington anniversary with the late Bob Moses, who is also now an ancestor. And I looked at these folks and said, well, who are these old guys? Like, who are these people that's telling us that we got to be nonviolent? What are they talking about, right? We have to be violent sometimes. And one of your previous panelists said this, Reverend James Lawson was always intergenerational. And one of the best experiences I will ever have was being a student in the James Lawson Institute in Nashville, where we sat for 3 or 4 days. I was actually looking at the agenda not too long ago of the types of conversations we were having that were things that you don't learn in school, and were organized in a way where young people could come with what they were experiencing and living right then and there, and have a discussion with elders who had already gone through the struggle in different and sometimes even worse ways. And you know, some of the listeners, Roland, might think of, you know, the Selma movie, and they'll remember Dr. Love, the character in the Selma movie, and learning about who James Lawson was through that film. They might watch Rustin, that just came out, and learn about CORE, which Reverend Lawson was a member of after Bayard Rustin created the organization. And we learned about these things from his mouth, and his teachings around nonviolence being a form of revolutionary resistance, and him having a engaging discussion with young organizers across the country who believed that maybe there was a time for armed resistance, maybe there was a time for violence to be resistance, right? And what I will take away from that discussion is not just his firm standing in the principle of nonviolent struggle, of healing resistance, of revolutionary nonviolence as a form of violence resistance, right? But I will also walk away with him as an accepting elder and mentor and teacher who served his purpose through his whole life, training and teaching people on how to make real changes in their communities. And so many people, right, and I said this on social media, so many people right now owe so much gratitude to Reverend Lawson for his leadership, his study, his work, his example, and his prayers over our communities as he fought against segregation. So many of us benefit from the direct acts and the direct protest and demonstration that Reverend Lawson did, and so many people's lives have been changed because of his work. And I agree again with the fellow panelists, he should have got a President's Award. And, you know, we want to give people their flowers while they're here. It's just so
Yep.
It is heartbreaking to know that he's no longer here with us, but that his legacy is what made America what it is today. And Roland, really quickly,
yeah, go ahead.
SNCC is hosting their 60th anniversary, which Reverend Lawson was also a member of, an advisor to for young people. And they'll be in Indianola, Mississippi. I will be there with Cortland Cox and Charlie Cobbs and Judy Richardson and Jennifer Lawson and so many of other peers that Reverend Lawson was.
When is that?
It is June 21st and 22nd. And it's in Indianola, Mississippi this month, so in 2 weeks.
Got it.
And if folks want more information, they can follow SNCC Legacy on Instagram, and they can go to sncdigital.org, and SNCC is spelled SNCC.
I opened the show with this when we were at CBC, and he was literally sitting in the corner. It's funny. I'm sitting here, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking about, and again. Look, we've been around, a lot of folks, and so, we know when Reverend Jackson, Reverend Sharpton, Andrew Young, Merle Evers Williams. We know. We can go on and on and on. When those folks enter the room and they bring them to the front, they seat them in the front, whatever. And it was, so I'm moderating the session. And again, Alpha President Dr. Everett Ward says, hey, he says, Frat, I'm about to leave. I'm here with Reverend Jim Lawson. And I went, where? He went, I said, Jim Lawson. Nashville moved with Jim Lawson. He's like, yeah. I'm like, where? He said, he over there. He was literally sitting in the corner, just watching and listening to the conversation. And that's the kind. And so then when I interviewed him, he said, because what happened was he promised his wife that he would always be home at dinner at 6 o'clock to eat with the family. That's why he wasn't at the Lorraine Motel when King was assassinated, the p.m. Memphis time. And so when I interviewed him, he said, my last image of Martin was he was in the pulpit, and I was on the last row at Mason Temple, and he said where he was supposed to be, and I was where I was supposed to be. And that statement is so profound because he understood everybody's not meant to be in the pulpit. In the pulpit, he's got to have somebody who's a Lawson, who's satisfied with not being center stage.
That's right. We don't have a lot of civil rights leaders like that now, Roland. There are a lot of folks who want to be in the front. There's a lot of folks who want to be in the pulpit, and they get mad when other people are in the pulpit. And I too have been in spaces where Reverend Lawson was there and just had, like I said, he was so intergenerational, but he was always creating space. And he wasn't somebody who walked, in my experience, he wasn't somebody who walked in the room and said, I know everything and I won civil rights like this and this is how y'all need to do it. He walked in the room and said, what's going on? Let me listen to what other people have to say. And went and studied in India, came back and gave us the philosophy, the theology, the experience. It was a gift to have his expertise and his experience and his critique and his study of nonviolent organizing. And, there's so much happening now across the world that we could talk about forever, which I won't, on how Reverend Lawson is currently influencing protests that are happening around America right now. And some people don't even know where they got it from. It came from Reverend James Lawson. But like you said, there's his spirit when he was here was one of purpose. He was so grounded in who he was and what his mission was. And it feels it's such a loss to have him transition at this time. But may we all live in the example of being humbled and walking around with humility so that we can help support and train the next wave of change that happens in this country.
Tiffany, certainly appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your thoughts about Reverend Dr. James Lawson.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Roland.
Folks, here is the rest of the eulogy that Reverend Lawson delivered at the funeral of Congressman John Lewis here in Atlanta just a few years ago.
That's why I've chosen just to say a few words about it. Kelly Miller Smith invited John Lewis. I met a Fisk student who told me about a student from Chicago who wanted to do something about those vicious signs. I said, invite Diane Nash to the workshop in September because we're going to do something about those signs. I pushed this hard. Now, John Lewis had no choice in the matter. You should understand that. Because all the stories we've heard this morning of John becoming a preacher, preaching to the chickens and other sorts of things, becoming ordained as a Baptist minister. Something else was happening to John in those early years. John saw the malignancy of racism in Troy, Alabama. There formed in him a sensibility that he had to do something about it. He did not know what that was, but he was convinced that he was called indeed to do whatever he could do, get in good trouble, but stop the horror that so many folk lived through and in this country in that part of the 20th century. John was not alone. Martin King had the same experience as a boy. I had the same experience from age 4 in the streets of Massillon, Ohio. Matthew McCullum, a pastor whose name you don't know in South Carolina, had the same experience. C.T. Vivian had the same experience. I maintain that many of us had no choice to do what we tried to do, primarily because at an early age we recognized the wrong under which we were forced to live, and we swore to God that by God's grace we would do whatever God called us to do in order to put on the table of the nation's agenda. This must end. Black Lives Matter. And so between 1953 and 1973, we had major campaigns year after year, thousands of demonstrations across the nation that supported it. We had folk in the Congress, folk in the White House, folks scattered across the United States who were beginning to formulate what the solutions are for change. The media makes a mistake when John is seen only in relationship to the Voting Rights Bill of '65. However important that is, you must not remember that in the '60s, Lyndon Johnson and the Congress of the United States passed the most advanced legislation on behalf of we, the people of the United States, that was ever passed. Head Start. Billions of dollars for housing. We would not be in the struggle we are today in housing if President Reagan hadn't cut that billions of dollars for housing, where local churches and local nonprofits could build affordable housing in their own communities, being sustained and financed by loans from the federal government. We passed Medicare. We passed anti-poverty programs, Civil Rights Bill 64, 65, voting rights bills, a whole array. John Lewis must be understood as one of the leaders of the greatest advance of Congress and the White House on behalf of we, the people of the USA. We do not need bipartisan politics if we're going to celebrate the life of John Lewis. We need the Constitution to come alive. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We need the Congress and the presidents to work unfalteringly on behalf of every boy and every girl, so that every baby born on these shores will have access to the tree of life. That's the only way to honor John Robert Lewis. No other way. Let all of us in this service today, let all the people of the USA determine that we will not be quiet as long as any child dies in the first year of life in the United States. We will not be quiet as long as the largest poverty group in our nation are women and children. We will not be quiet as long as our nation continues to be the most violent culture in the history of humankind. We will not be quiet as long as our economy is shaped not by freedom, but by plantation capitalism that continues to cause domination and control rather than access and liberty and equality for all. The forces of spiritual wickedness are strong in our land because of our history. We have not created them. John Lewis did not create them. We inherited them. But it's our task to see those spiritual forces. I've named them: racism, sexism, violence, plantation capitalism. Those poisons still dominate far too many of us in many different ways. John's life was a singular journey from birth through the campaigns in the South, through Congress, to get us to see that these forces of wickedness must be resisted. Do not let our own hearts drink any of that poison. Instead, drink the truth of the life force. If we would honor and celebrate John Lewis's life, let us then recommit our souls, our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our strength to the continuing journey to dismantle the wrong in our midst, and to allow a space for the new earth and new heaven to emerge. I close with this poem from Langston Hughes, which is a kind of a sign and symbol of what John Lewis represents and what we too can represent in our continuing journey. Langston Hughes. I dream a world where no human, no other human will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace its paths adorn. I dream a dream where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black and white and yellow and blue and green and red and brown, whatever your race may be, will share the bounties of the earth. And every woman and man and boy and girl is free. Where wretchedness hangs its head, and joy, like a pearl, attends the need of all humankind. Of such a world I dream. Celebrate life, dream and labor for an Atlanta and Los Angeles and the United States and a world. That is to celebrate the spirit and the heart and the mind and soul of John Lewis, and to walk with him through the galaxies, seeking equality, liberty, justice, and the beloved community for all. Thank you.
As I said, absolutely powerful and riveting, and that's when he was 91 years old. Going to go to a break. We come back. My one-on-one with Reverend James Lawson. The interview was shot 2018 in Los Angeles. It is one that I guarantee you will blow you away. You're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered right here on the Black Star Network. What we do, folks, we often do these tributes. I call them digital homegoings because I fundamentally believe that we need to pay proper tribute when we lose our great folks and become ancestors. I doubt very seriously you're going to see significant coverage death on any of these networks, but he's deserving of this type of tribute because when we do this, we are introducing or teaching a whole new generation of folks who didn't know. I don't mean just young people. There are people who are Gen X or baby boomers who may have never heard of Reverend James Lawson. So it's important that we have platforms that allow us to be able to do these things and not just give 30 seconds, a minute, or a couple of minutes, but give proper respect and deference to the work of folks like Reverend Lawson. So when you join our Bring the Funk fan club, your dollars are making it possible for us to do that. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing on average $50 each. That's $4.19 a month, 13 cents a day. If you want to support our work, send your check and money order to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C., 20037-0196. Cash App, $RM Unfiltered, PayPal, R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle, Roland at RolandSMartin.com, Roland at RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. When we come back, you'll hear my sit-down conversation with Reverend Jim Lawson, now an ancestor. He passed away on Sunday at the age of 95. Back in a moment. When you talk about blackness and what happens in black culture, we're about covering these things that matter to us, speaking to our issues and concerns.
This is a genuine people-powered movement.
There's a lot of stuff that we're not getting. You get it, and you spread the word.
We wish to plead our own cause too long have others spoken for us. We cannot tell our own story if we can't pay for it. This is about covering us. Invest in black-owned media. Your dollars matter. We don't have to keep asking them to cover our stuff. So please support us in what we do, folks. We want to hit 2,000 people, $50 this month, raise $100,000. We're behind 100,000, so we want to hit that. Y'all money makes this possible. Checks and money orders go to P.O. Box 57196, Washington, D.C. 20037-0196. The Cash App is $RM Unfiltered. PayPal is R Martin Unfiltered. Venmo is RM Unfiltered. Zelle is Roland at RolandSMartin.com.
Now streaming on the Black Star Network.
It was my junior year at Georgetown, and Spike calls me and he says, Malcolm, what are you doing next year? So, graduating, you know? He said, take a year off, work on Malcolm X. I said, okay.
But first of all, for the folks who don't know, Spike is
my cousin. Spike is my cousin.
Just for the person watching, like, how the hell is Spike just gonna tell you that it's true? It's true.
What's up, everybody? It's your girl, Latasha from the A.
And you're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered.
We're going to continue our tribute to Reverend Dr. James Lawson. Just keep in mind, at the White House, they will soon be beginning the Juneteenth concert taking place there. We will be live streaming that, remarks made by President Joe Biden as well as Vice President Kamala Harris. And so we have a secondary stream on the Black Star Network. So if you go to the app or go to our YouTube channel, you will actually see that additional stream. So just letting you know that we are keeping our eye on that particular event as well. Also, folks, so we're going to roll this video here, but before I do that, let me shout out my parents, Reginald and Imelda Martin, today celebrating their 57th wedding anniversary. So just want to give them a shout out before we actually roll this interview. So again, happy anniversary to my parents. Folks, 6 years ago, I told you earlier about when the folks at TV1 completely screwed up and lost my James Lawson interview. Have no idea. They just never ingested the interview. Don't even ask me. It still pisses me off. But later in the year, I was in Los Angeles and decided I was doing some other interviews with the folks with Be Woke Vote. And I decided to call Reverend Lawson and begged him to do the interview. And I'm so glad that he actually said yes to that. And so this here is that conversation. We talked about voting, talked about a lot of different things. I think you'll learn a lot from this conversation. Here it is. Folks, welcome to BeWoke.vote. I'm your host, Roland Martin, also the host of Roland Martin Unfiltered. When we think about some of the greatest organizers and teachers, when we think about the Black freedom movement, some call the Civil Rights movement, we often hear the names like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We hear, of course, Roy Wilkins. We might hear about Fannie Lou Hamer. But I've always said two of the most unsung heroes, Ella Baker, one of the greatest organizers that we have ever seen, and also my next guest, Reverend James Lawson. He joins us right now. Glad to have him here. So I was having a conversation with Omar, who's working behind that wall right there. And we were talking about young folks and voting and how do we keep people mobilized. And I said the most underappreciated aspect of the Black freedom movement is the fact that y'all taught folks, that was teaching, that was training. You didn't just wake up, go to a rally.
No, that's right.
You taught folks first.
Yes, sir. We help people to interpret our history, not so much from the perspective of the conventional wisdom, but from the point of view of equality, justice, freedom, that they were human beings. They had the greatest gift of life, and that they had to cultivate that gift in every respect: heart, soul, mind, strength, capacity to be alive, and to be human, and to act together. So we mobilized many people. Congressman John Lewis is a consequence of that work that I began in 1958-59 in Nashville, Tennessee. We help people to prepare for the short-term direct action, nonviolent direct action, as that movement emerged, but we also help prepare people for the long run of their lives and for the quality of their lives. And of course, a significant part of that was the fact that as a human being, you can stay awake, you can be alive, you can love, you can serve, you can dissolve injustice in yourself and outside yourself, and you can keep at it with your neighbors and with other people. So that movement was the greatest movement America had from 1775, I'm going to say, to 1955 and beyond. The 1955 20th century rendition of it was the greatest movement in modern times.
You call it, though, when I last talked to you, you have your own name for it. Other people call it the Civil Rights Movement. They might call it the Black Freedom Movement. Yeah. But you invoke Rosa Parks in it.
Yes, I call the main energy of that period the Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Movement of America. Or I call it the Rosa Parks, Martin King Campaign for Equality and Justice, rather than calling it the Civil Rights Movement.
Why?
Because in a society of male domination and chauvinism, in a society where there's been for 400 years so much sexism and racism, so much economic cruelty and oppression, it all gets, the American people do not have choices. The conventional perspective of history excludes too much of the history of cruelty. James Baldwin spoke about the bloody catalog of our history. That bloody catalog is more influential today in many, many people than any other facet of American history. And it's blind, it is invisible, it's unseen, and therefore many people yield to it. The 53 million white women who voted for Trump in the last presidential election were yielding to those dark forces that are invisible, but are visible if we want to make them visible. And so our movement sought to make those forces visible so that we could see them, and then we could dissolve them. We could fight back, we could resist, we could create an alternative vision of what we can become.
I've had people tell me, dude, why do you keep focusing on the teaching and the training? I interviewed Dorothy Cotton leading up to MLK 50. And it was her last sit-down interview before she passed away. And her job, she had the most important job at SCLC.
That's right.
And in her book, she writes about it. She said the people who wanted to come into the SCLC, they had to come into my classes. We had to assess where they were mentally. She said, take out all of that other stuff that was in their head.
That's right.
She said, reprogram their brains and then send them out. And when I see what Reverend Dr. William Barber is doing, every time he and I talk, he said, we're not having rallies, we're having trainings. We're having workshops. He said, we're teaching people because people don't quite understand what is required to actually create lasting change.
In the first instance, they do not, I'll say it another way. In many cases, people growing up in the United States, birthed and raised here, do not understand that in the first instance, the gift of life is the greatest gift that we have. it is given to us. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that all are endowed with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that's never taught. That's not in the conventional conversations that people engaged in around the country. In an election year like this year of 2018, that's not either in the surface or in the headlines. It's nowhere in the conversation, in the discussion of Supreme Court and the Supreme Court Justice who was recently elected to it. So people don't know that that's the heart and foundation of how this country came to be. In that sense, we were very, very unique as a people. Even though from the beginning, 1776, blacks were excluded, Indians were excluded, people who had no property were excluded, women were excluded. Because that whole idea was not an idea that this is our reality. That idea was we're going to create a country in which that ideal is the paramount feature of how we organize ourselves, economically and politically. That's a very, very different kind of scheme.
You were a university professor dealing with young people in the Nashville movement.
No, I was a pastor.
I'm sorry.
At first, I was a full-time organizer in the emerging nonviolent movement, teaching people the philosophy and the theory and the tactic of nonviolence. So, for an example, the Little Rock Nine, 1957, 58, 59. They were told by the lawyers and the NAACP and the white school board in Little Rock that if you get hit, you cannot hit back. If you get lots of terrible cussing at yourself and so forth, you may not cuss back. And that was a dominant pattern in those desegregation processes. So I tried to help them understand that what they were really being told was not to not fight back, but to fight back with dignity, to fight back with courage, to fight back with compassion. Do not allow the hostility to make you sick as a human being, but allow the hostility to be used that you conquer it and can live through it and work through it and become yourself a stronger person than you ever imagined possible.
And you had to confront that when it came to the war. And you could have gotten out of serving. And you said, I'm not going.
Well, it was actually, it's actually something else. I met my first racist epithet at age 4 in the streets of Massillon, Ohio. And I struck out and began to fight that white boy who lived in my neighborhood. We were playmates, but he was being taught that poison. That whole experience made me aware of the fact that I was called to be a human being and that names and all could not destroy me, but that they had to be resisted in order to be changed. So as I grew older, I realized, therefore, that every racist law, every racist ideology, every Jim Crow law, every no to being a man, a person in the world, I had to reject and resist. Then I recognized that the Selective Service Act was also an unjust law, and that therefore I did not want to obey it. Though I had registered in the draft, I was making the effort to follow Jesus. I was making the effort to be a person who resisted every form of injustice and cruelty to other human beings or to myself. So I decided that the Selective Service Act was an unfair act. Now, this later was confirmed in 1960 when in Memphis, as a pastor of a large congregation, I had 4 to 6 young black men who were college students who were not exempted by the white draft boards, but drafted. A student could be exempted. Paige Parker and others in my congregation were not exempted. So the death rate in Vietnam, in a Memphis city, was 50% white boys, 50% black boys. Though white was the majority community. The same thing went on all across the country. Few people were aware of that. But that's how unfair and unjust selective service acts were. So I simply said I would not cooperate with that. 67 then,
but you could have got a waiver.
Huh?
But you could have got out of that.
I could have gotten out of it, of course. But that's not the way of the conscience. The way of conscience is to walk through the issues that are unfair and unjust and to deal with them to the best of your ability.
And you paid for it.
Yeah, I went to prison for 13 months, federal prison. That's correct. At age 21, 22.
Did you have...
Interfered with my college degree.
Did you have relatives or professors or friends saying, James, what are you doing?
No, I had...
Man, you can get out. What are you doing?
Well, not my close friends, not my younger brothers, not my father or mother. My family supported me thoroughly and firmly, and a number of friends in college also were in my camp and understood that it was, in a way, this is what we're asking people to do in this election. You have to develop a conscience in which you know that voting and participating in resisting the wrong in your society is a part of the price you pay for the gift of life that you have received from the universe. That's part of the gift. And so you have to deal with that. And in the United States, we've made things so easy because we pretend we've been exceptional. We haven't had a hard struggle that the Indians didn't get decimated from maybe 11 million to less than 2 million in 200 years, or that we did not have endless wars with the Indian peoples across this nation. We've pretended all of that's hidden. But the reality is that that was invisible to some. And white political philosophers, and I also think white media people, white professors, leave that history out of the public mix so that many ordinary citizens do not know the price that has been paid by other people for them having the opportunities and access that we do have today. That's part of the reality of conventional thinking.
Earlier this year, we were in Memphis for MLK 50.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And it is still amazing and just stunning and powerful when you see that just basic sign, I am a man.
Exactly.
Where did that come from? Where? Because most people see it, but that had to come from somewhere.
Yes, that's right. It comes from black song in the centuries of slavery, especially that huge body of literature, which is called the Negro spiritual or black song. When you go through some of that music, and I remember, for an example, as a child singing "Go Down Moses, Let My People Go." Well, that's a liberation song. That's a resistance song. It comes out of the Hebrew Bible. That song and many other songs like that in that black song literature said over and over again, and oftentimes in masked language. You are not a slave, you are somebody. You are a child of the universe, you are a child of God. You are loved, you are created in love. Your task is not to allow this slavery to capture your soul or diminish your humanity, but to grow into the full bloom of that humanity. So I am a man, you are somebody, we are the people of God is a part of the kind of mantras from the past. And I use that very frequently in all of our struggles across the southeastern part of the country, in Nashville, in Jackson, Mississippi, in the sanitation strike in Danville, Virginia, all around. That was a common message from Dr. King, from Ralph Abernathy, from Matthew McCullough, from Kelly Miller Smith, from a whole range of preachers who were actively engaged in that big movement to desegregate public life in the United States.
You mentioned sanitation workers. When I interviewed labor organizers who were working with those sanitation workers, we were having this conversation, and I said, folks, I said, you know, whenever we talk about Memphis, Dr. King being in Memphis, for me, the problem is that we forget why he was there. It was those men who said, we demand respect.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I talked to some of those men, I talked to their children, and the two workers who died.
Yes.
I talked to one of the sons, and I asked him, I said, what do you want people to know about your father? Because frankly, most people don't even know those two names. That's and he said, I want them to know that my dad just wanted to feed his family.
Yes, that's right. They were hardworking people who thought that their responsibility with their family and for their family, with their wives and all, demanded that they stand up and seek change in that year of 1968. That's correct. Any number of them were baptized people of the churches where they heard some of these messages there. They had a deep nobility about themselves that made it possible for them to take on the economic system in the Memphis Mid-South area. And they decided that mm-hmm. before anyone else in the community did, you see. Mm-hmm. While I knew of the struggle going on and knew T.O. Jones, the chief organizer, and told him I'd be supportive in any way I could, nevertheless, they themselves made the decision that the strike was the only way they could create the power to change what they called the plantation.
And that distinction is important because, again, what often happens when history is rewritten, it becomes, oh, no, this was a leader and that was a leader. And so, for instance, I mean, they tasked you with making the call to Dr. King to come to Memphis.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But it was the men who said, we are doing this.
Yeah, that's right. And I've been asked about, well, how does it feel that you invited Martin King? Well, Martin King and I were associates from 1955 on. And I went where he asked me to come all the time. That was a part of our work. He was a member of the movement. He was the symbol, in my judgment, of that movement. Mm-hmm. And he personified it because of the Montgomery bus boycott. So the phone calls I made, but the phone calls were made as a part of the strategies of the sanitation strike, as the mass meetings were a part of that strategy, as the daily picket marches that we did in downtown, as was the economic boycott, as the recruitment of young people to participate in afternoon marches. So all of that represents a part of the massive number of pieces of a movement. And then, of course, most of all, the people, the 1,300 workers, and the tens of thousands of us who supported them. So the issue for me is not conventional leadership, because it takes all of that for a movement that become a campaign that can forge the philosophy and the power that can push the envelope of injustice in the direction of justice. It cannot be done without the great numbers of people.
And what you just described is, again, in Barbara Ransby's book on Ella Baker, where she and MLK differed. She argued that MLK believed that it was pulpit to pew. Baker said, no, it's pew to pulpit. She said, when you move the people and organize the people, she said, leadership will naturally follow. I thought that was an interesting, how that was framed in that particular book.
But I want to say, white academy never understood the movement. And the tendency in the academy has been, and I teach still at UCLA, the academy's notion has always been to lift the differences. But the reality is that any kind of movement has the most vigorous kind of conversation and debate, oftentimes with even a lot of anger and fear in the midst of it. We were doing something we had never done before and had never done before in this country. We were publicly, through direct action, challenging the hostility and the segregation signs, laws, and customs and attitudes. That had never been done before. So we were doing work that we did not know how to do, except we had a passion for the sense that this was cruelty and crude. And as Martin King, of course, also reminded us, it was contrary to the Declaration of Independence, it was contrary to the Constitution of the United States, so it had to be resisted. So some of the differences between maybe younger and older, irrelevant. Martin King was only 10 years older than Diane Nash, only 11 years older than John Lewis. Martin King and I was the same age, 5 years apart. So we were all young people in that movement, in my judgment. So SNCC and SCLC did not have that much difference. I was a founder of SNCC and a participant in the organization of SCLC and the development of SCLC. So those differences are how you hammer out a consensus so that when the call is out that we strike, we strike. When the call is out that we have a mass meeting, we have a mass meeting. A movement takes a great deal of consensus, and you cannot reach consensus without oftentimes a long, hard process of conversation, debate, argument, bouncing human experience against human experience until we come out at the right place.
I was at Mason Temple on April 3rd, where they had
April 3rd, 2018.
Yeah, I was there.
Year.
I was at 2018.
Yeah, that's right.
You were there April 3rd, 1968.
That's right. I was there, yeah.
And for the folks who just don't know, I mean, I'm doing this purposely because and the reason I'm doing this is because you were there. I need people to understand that how they heard these things and what's been framed, it's been retold by people who weren't there. That night, I think when we last talked, you said that either did you drive Dr. King to the church or made the call to say, Doc, you need to get over here because they're not trying to hear Ralph Abernathy. Well, they want to hear you.
We had been visiting in the motel room from around 5 o'clock on. I had agreed that I would take Martin King and Ralph Abernathy to the mass meeting at 7 o'clock. So I got there early enough so we could visit about everything that needed to be talked about. April the 3rd, by that time, it was a very stormy night. And my colleague, Martin King, was of the mind that no one would show up. And he's always fairly tired. His energy and passion for the work is what very often gave him the drive that he had. So he begged off going, and the three of us finally agreed that Ralph Abernathy and I would drive on to the Mason Temple. That if we felt felt that King needed to come, we would call back, which is what happened. There were several thousand people there. Well, one of the interesting things about Memphis is that it was the first major campaign we had anywhere in the South where we had an auditorium that we could use that could seat 8,000 people. Sometimes, as in Birmingham and Nashville, we would have 4 or 5 meetings in 4 or 5 different churches, and some of us would make each church and maybe finish up at 1 o'clock in the morning. King did this all the time in our meetings. So here, the Church of God in Christ had this sizable temple that seated 8,000 people, and people standing would fill it to somewhere between 10,000, 12,000 people. So he expected it to be empty with all that rain, whereas we were in the midst of really a very remarkable struggle that had massive support from black people and a few people, white people of goodwill. And so we were there in large numbers. When Ralph and I got there, the church was already filling up, the temple was already filling up. And so as soon as we called King, he came on over there, because he was one of the reasons people were there, to hear him and to be with him.
It drives me crazy when I only hear people play the last 2.5 minutes of that sermon.
Of that speech, yeah.
And I tell people, I say, yo, that's a 43-minute and 16-second amazing sermon, speech, lesson, lecture.
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
When you were sitting there, did you understand how major this was, just listening to it? Because obviously, we've gone our own history, but sitting there, were you going, this is an amazing speech, sermon?
Yeah. Yes, it was one of his best, and I heard that, but I was also chair of the strategy and of the work.
You were working?
Yes, and so I kept getting phone calls and people coming up to the dais and saying, somebody insists that you have to come back here and talk. And so I finally left the dais and sat down at the bottom of the aisle of where the public phone was so that I wouldn't have to keep running back and forth. The other thing that was operative was a storm, and this building had a tin roof, and so the rain was battering that roof, and the wind was blowing, and the rafters were bouncing against the tin. So you hear all of this, but in the midst of that, this sizable crowd of people are in harmony with one another. We know that we have a task to do and that we're in the middle of it. And in the midst of that, King is speaking. So it's an astonishing evening. I've never forgotten it. I sat on those steps in some degree of awe and amazement as I saw this space and this crowd of people. So the setting itself was rather extraordinary.
April 4th.
April 3rd.
No, I got April 3rd.
April 3rd, yeah.
But April 4th.
Yeah. None of us, of course, knew that the next day would be the assassination. Martin King always talked about the fact that he would be shot down in the streets of the nation in the midst of this campaign. He started talking to us about that actually with the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of '63.
Were it not for a promise you made to your wife, you probably would have been on that balcony.
Well, who knows? Yeah.
But y'all were meeting, y'all. All those different.
Well, as a family, we try to eat dinner together each night. So.
And you told me, you said,
yeah,
I'll be home by 6.
That's right. We agreed 6 o'clock dinner, and so I was on my way home. I was in the kitchen with Dorothy when we heard the news over a television set that Dr. King had been shot.
At 6:01.
Now I just left him, not too long before that.
I was stunned when you said, we immediately went back to work, that you did not really grieve until July. You said it was the work.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Well, in the midst of, like these terrible times in which we live, doing creative work on behalf of truth and justice, on behalf of people, on behalf of the wonder of life, on behalf of dissolving sexism and racism, doing work is one of the best ways for us to grieve. So I recognize that as a pastor, as a religious person. So yes, 9 o'clock Friday morning, we marched. And I worked through the night to be sure that we were going to be there.
We're trying to get folks not just to vote.
Right, that's right.
But to get them to understand that voting is a process. But what you must do after the election is over is this. So voting is the end of one process, then after the election is the beginning of another process.
Voting is but one tactic that comes ever so often. In between, we have to be people deeply engaged in being informed about what our situation is, what the situation of our neighbors is, be concerned for racism, for economic injustice, for working families. So if we stay informed in a daily way, in our own neighborhood, in our own family, and around the community, then the voting becomes a major step that we're more than eager to go ahead and do it well. Get informed, as we in California have to be this year, because we have so many measures on the ballot, as well as Congress, and many of those measures are deceptive, some of the measures are not. So to be engaged, to be an engaged human being, not a distracted human being, but a human being who is what the Buddhists called mindful, to have mindfulness of where you are and what's going on around you. This is one of our major problems. We have that almost is unaware of the plight of 325 million people in this country. They do not know us. When the Me Too movement explodes, those 11 senators in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate and Congress, they hadn't the slightest idea what this was about. If they knew their country, they would know that second-class citizenship for women and using women as objects for sex has been a long time form of oppression in this country and elsewhere. They would have known of the rape of Indian women, of the rape of slave women. They would know that this was a part of the instrumentality of cruelty that our own country practiced in various ways. So they would know that they would have known behind the scenes, the Dr. Ford's story is but one story of millions and millions of people all across our country.
When you saw the folks, the women who were on Capitol Hill, and when you saw the folks who were banging on the door of the Supreme Court, and then Mitch McConnell says, "Oh, these angry mobs and these paid protesters, and they wanted to harm us, and this is uncivil." How would you respond to Mitch McConnell?
Well, Mitch McConnell is one of the most crude, cruel men we have ever had a political figure in this nation, and as a majority leader. That's number one. Number two is that what the media calls the protests was all right, I suppose. But from my perspective, as a strategist of direct action, it was a mistake.
How?
Number one, Judge Kavanaugh, anyone who knows anything about the last 50 years in the United States knows what Judge Kavanaugh represents. Mm-hmm. He represents sexism. He does. He represents racism. The Federalist Society is a society that grew up out of the desegregation movement of the 60s and 70s, and out of the Supreme Court saying that the Constitution includes everybody. The first time that ever happened from the Supreme Court was in 1954. Mm-hmm. So Kavanaugh represents that element of white lawyers, some of them evangelical, but much more than people of power who want to wield domination and control. He represents that whole strain of people who decided that the Supreme Court is too activist. It has to go back and interpret the Constitution as in 1896 or as in 1849. It has to continue to be a Supreme Court that sees the Constitution but doesn't see all the people in the country. That's what he represents, and that's what other people on that Supreme Court today represent. That's a part of the movement of the so-called conservatism, which is not conservatism in the classical sense at all, but is a group that wants to preserve American society as a male-dominated, largely white male chauvinistic society with economic injustice extending to millions and millions of people.
When you said as a strategist, you thought they made a mistake.
Yes, because number one, it should have been an inclusive movement. The picture should not have been primarily of women. Black people should have been mobilized in that effort. They should not have worked by themselves. They should have worked with black community groups. They should have worked with Hispanic community groups. They should have worked with male groups. They should have worked with GLBT groups. So there was a diverse, multi-ethnic, heavily mixed gender protest campaign. And because that is the way that campaigns in the 21st century must be. They must represent all the voices in this country who are seeking equality and liberty for all.
You are not afraid to challenge folks who lead organizations or movements or whatever. When I asked you about Black Lives Matter, mm-hmm. you said, again, as a strategist, you have some serious concerns.
Yes, because all through the 20th century, all kinds of people around the world took on major tasks of doing justice in which they used the philosophy and theory and the tactics of nonviolence. Gandhi of India is the person who in 1906, as he fought against the Boer Empire and the British Empire in South Africa, tried to begin to pull this together and began to use the term nonviolence, soul force, began to use the term love force. He's the one who defined nonviolence as the use of the power of love and compassion in practical ways so that it demonstrates power to move power away from its crude elements and to move power towards community, to move power towards the use of feeding the hungry, of dissolving racism and segregation and the like. So Gandhi can be called the father of nonviolence. He in his autobiography, Gandhi insists that he's worked on this for some 50 years. He collected strikes. He participated in strikes. He participated in sit-in campaigns. He participated in campaigns to help sharecroppers in India. He fought the racism of the British Empire in South Africa and elsewhere. So activists who do not know that literature, are not paying attention to it, therefore do not have the arsenal of behavior that can move power. Sit-in campaign, Nashville, Tennessee, 1959-60. It was a group of community people who decided, and it was unheard of in the United States, we are going to desegregate downtown Nashville. That had not even been talked about. It came about because we had for 6 months weekly Saturday morning meetings where 30 to 60 of us met at Saturday morning, and we thrashed out what is the situation we're facing? What are these issues we look at? The first 3 months, we did nothing but a laundry list of the plight of the Negro in Nashville, Tennessee.
So you didn't plan a march? You didn't plan a rally?
We didn't plan anything. Then the next 3 months, April, May, June, we thrashed out the laundry list and said, where do we begin to demonstrate that Montgomery bus boycott was not an accident, it's an agency of history, and it can be repeated. And the unanimous decision out of those meetings was, we will desegregate downtown Nashville. You can search the periodicals and the publications and the congressional reports, NAACP studies. You will not find that any group of people anywhere in the country at that moment had said, we're going to pull those white colored signs down. There will be no more signs. No dirty Jew. No dirty wop. No wetback. No chink. No Jap. No colored. No Negro. White only. Those signs are going to come down. That was a part of the task. This is a period of history that did not begin to end until 1960s. Understand that. That group in Nashville, I'm astonished that we came to that consensus. I'm saying to myself, good heavens, how are we going to do this? I was supposed to be the strategist. I had never organized a campaign before like that. Though I had studied studied Gandhi and nonviolence around the world for some 10 years, lived in India for 3 years and followed Gandhi. Though he was dead, I followed his people in India. I will never forget the experience when that decision was made in June, my saying to myself, what have we done? And how is this going to be accomplished? There were no guidelines at that moment. And I proceeded then, and C.T. Vivian was a pastor in the city at that time. I did not know John Lewis at that time. I did not know Diane Nash. I did not know Miriam Berry. These were all people we recruited to come to the first workshops in the fall of '59 as we began preparing ourselves to do this work. So that threw into the United States a local community that offered a methodology that had been well researched and that we knew could effectively mobilize the forces that would say those signs are immoral, they're bad, and then would have the power to force the political system, the newspaper system, the business system to say they must come down. The city has to begin desegregation. And so Nashville was the first city in the southeastern part of the country that began to pull those signs down, renovate restrooms and waiting rooms in public places, pull the public signs down, the private signs down. And of course then the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, with a lot of Republicans and Democrats supporting it, then outlawed a private or a public institution having such signs anywhere around the premises, or being able to say certain people of the USA can't come in here to have a hot dog or a Coke. So now it became law in '64. But it is Nashville that moved the people in such a fashion that We represented a power that could not be smothered and a power that could not be denied its right to demand that a little bit of justice begin.
So what do you tell somebody today? What do you tell that young person who's watching, that person who was in the 20s or 30s, who says, okay, Reverend Lawson, that's great, I hear you, but everything you're talking about, that can't be used today. That won't work today. This is a whole different world. Everything that you've done, I appreciate it, but it can't work in the 21st century.
First of all, such a young person represents the United States of America and its conventional culture. That's what I've heard all my life, in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and today. But they better begin to recognize that in socio-political issues, cultural issues, there are some rules that the universe will not allow to be broken. For an example, an ancient wisdom has said this. Jesus said you cannot get grapes out of a thistle bush. Jesus of Nazareth, without all the Christian dogma that gets in the way of the teacher and what the person did in his own time, you can't get grapes out of a thistle bush. You cannot get figs out of a thorn bush. You have to get grapes out of a grapevine. The same is true in terms of the principles of political struggle, social struggle. You cannot overcome the forces of Trumpism by imitating Trumpism in language or in behavior or in vision. You cannot do eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth with Trump and expect you're going to get rid of him. I think the voices that say, you know, this election is going to do it, are nonsense. The forces of wickedness that Trump produced, are now on the rise in Europe as well as in the United States. Mm-hmm. So we should not be surprised if Trump is maybe only the first president of this caliber, of this kind of meanness, of this kind of power hungriness. It could happen, and I do not see national political voices who recognize the simple fact. Trump can only be defeated by a vision and a movement that does not act like Trump, but acts like people who know that they are alive and that love and truth are the ways that we best exemplify our humanity and the gift of life. There's no difference. And this is what greatly troubles me, because I listen to certain commentaries. I read the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. I read a number of different magazines all the time, a practice that I started in 1942. And I recognize that the voices that will allow we, the people of the USA, not to lose our struggle for truth and beauty, are not there at this moment.
You just turned 90.
I just turned 90.
You spent nearly all your life in that pursuit of equality and freedom.
Yes, that's yeah. Mm-hmm.
Someone might say, if you couldn't achieve this thing in 90 years, I just don't see it happening.
Yeah.
Do you believe that it will happen for those who have been disenfranchised, who have been oppressed by white male supremacy in the United States? Can we actually achieve that?
My great-great-grandparents, we have learned, were slaves. My great-grandfather, as a very young man, with a small young son, escaped slavery going up through the Underground Railroad, through Philadelphia, up into the Guelph area of Ontario, where my dad was born. Now, all kinds of people then said that slavery is not supposed to be what's going on. We will have to destroy it. So my great-grandfather was one of the people, as a very young man, who then said, I'm not going to live here under slavery any longer. So we don't have slavery now. Now, I have to admit that there's some forms of slavery in other names in the United States. The people who work 60 and 80 hours a day and then have a hard time keeping food on their table or shelter over their head or caring for their children and transportation is of course, another form of slavery, though it's not called that. The point I'm making is that we're at this mark in our history because the changes to become a nation under God, where in fact justice and access for every baby is birthed, is underway. And Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, represents the old order who would like to turn the clock back. But the clock is not going to be turned back. There may be great agony along the way between now and then, but the American people already have indicated that they don't want to go back to segregation. That especially young people today, and if we could get young people to follow the example of Gandhi or Rosa Parks and to strategize their behavior. America says you must do something. Well, doing something that doesn't work is the same as doing nothing. That's Gandhi. So what we did in the Birmingham campaign, the St. Augustine campaign, the Albany, Georgia campaign, the Freedom Ride, the Mississippi Summer campaigns, where we strategized and we analyzed our system and tried to put together the strategic offense that would make a difference. That kind of work in activism is essential work for the next 100 years or so.
Two more questions. If there is a group that's assembled, and that group is Pastor Robert Jeffress, Jerry Falwell Jr., Franklin Graham, Paula White, Tony Perkins, Ralph Reed.
Yes, Ralph Reed especially.
All these white conservative evangelicals who say they all love Jesus.
No, they don't. They don't know what that means.
If that group is assembled, and you are standing before them, what do you tell them?
Well, my own idea is that it would be better for me to show them than to tell them.
Show them what?
In the 50s, Jerry Falwell, that you mentioned, Pat Robinson, Perkins, Jim Dobson, those are all people of my generation. They were all thoroughgoing, in public ways and in private ways, racist, who said segregation forever, who said Jim Crow laws are the way that we have to live. Jerry Falwell preached this on his old-fashioned revival hour broadcast on Sunday night that was a national broadcast. Our movement out of the 50s, 55, 59, 60, made them change their story, made them stop preaching and teaching racism. We did it not by talking to them, but through the sit-in campaign, the bus campaign. Bus campaigns around the Southeastern, including Lynchburg, Virginia, in which the signs came down. So that stopped them. Now, one of my friends who was a gay man from way, way back, and the theologian and evangelical, Mel White, started in that same period to tell these people that they had to stop preaching racism. They started preaching then against gay and lesbian people. Now you can see that in their broadcasts, in their sermons, in their books. So they were people who did not have the self-esteem that came up out of their very souls, out of their beings, out of their bones. They had the self-esteem that said, I'm superior than you are. I'm a man, and therefore, woman, you're submissive. So they have to have a religious teaching that gave them superiority over some other people.
Right.
So that's where the whole push against gay people and lesbian people began to pick up on the radio and in television broadcast shows. That in itself reveals how weak their religion was. Their religion was not rooted in Jesus or Moses at all, but rooted in USA culture of male chauvinism and domination of some group of people over other people. So we showed them in the movement that they had to stop. And while this hasn't yet happened in terms of gay lesbian issues, and that's a much smaller issue in terms of the numbers of people who are involved, and it's a more diverse, complicated issue because it means that we human beings have to realign our understanding of human sexuality, which many of us are not willing to do. It means, in the Christian world, it means stop saying that sexuality represents how original sin is passed from parents to babies. That's stupidity that came out of the 4th century. So a whole society has to change its understanding and see human sexuality as a good gift of creation, a good gift of life that can be appropriated for the advancement of life and for the achieving human potential. So it's more complicated in that sense. But the point I want to make is that two things. One, yes, every form of discrimination against people, whether it's for complexion or creed or politics or whatever, it doesn't matter. Every form of injustice that deprives people and babies of access must be abolished. That's the task. So it's much greater than even our work in the United States. And the second thing then that I want to emphasize is that these enemies of human life, in many ways, they cannot be talked to very well. They have to be shown by a struggle that allows them to recognize that they're up against a soul force that they cannot smother, that they cannot stop, and that ultimately will demand that the systems of domination will change. And a part of that is what's going on today, to the great dismay of too many people. So the King movement of 1955 is the first time in a very violent civilization, Western civilization, any sizable group of people started to work to change by insisting we can use nonviolence power to create the change. Gandhi said that nonviolent power, the power of life, is the greatest and most creative power of the universe. And that if we human beings turn away from conventional wisdom towards using the gift of life, which is ours at birth, we would be surprised what the future of the human race will look like.
Last task. You come upon a young person. You come upon somebody who's in their 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s. And they say, Reverend Lawson, I listened to all that stuff you laid out. I appreciate all of that. I just do not believe that voting will make any difference whatsoever. They ignored that sign that's at the Civil Rights Museum, formerly the Lorraine Motel, where that black girl said, all I want for my 18th birthday is a voter registration card. They say that stuff doesn't matter. You got 30 seconds. That's all you have. You might be getting on the plane, getting in the car. You might be trying to get to your house. All you got is 30 seconds to tell them why they must vote. What do you say?
All right, I'm not sure I can handle that issue, but...
A little hard for a preacher to have 30 seconds, huh?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. You cannot fulfill your life if you're not willing to engage in the tactics and strategies that makes your own life grow and helps you to build the community in which you want to live. Voting is a singular method for a people locally and regionally to govern themselves.
28 seconds. Reverend Lawson, I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks a bunch.
This evening? Are you taking life notes? This is the, Oprah calls it the master class. This is something past that. So now we move to the part of our program where we talk about how you make a plan. And when plan A doesn't work, what about plan B, C? And when you find yourself at plan Z, do you keep on going? The architect of the nonviolent resistance, the man who wrote the blueprint for the plan, and the giant who executed it beautifully. Our next panel. We often hear people don't need an introduction. Well, this is gospel. Neither of these civil rights icons needs me to say anything more than their name. Can I please get you on your feet to welcome to the stage the great Congressman, John Lewis. And remain on your feet, ladies and gentlemen, for the man who is the blueprint, the creator, the architect of it all, Reverend James Lawson. Please stay on your feet and give these men the honor they so gratefully have earned from all of us here. How are you? We're going to get right to it because there is no time to waste. If you've watched the news, if you've read a paper, you know the time is now. Congressman, let's talk about where we are. Millions of people around this country marched in defiance against what they see are gun laws that are not serving the people. Where are we today as it relates to the ability to sustain a movement? to keep it going 50 years after Dr. King's assassination?
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here tonight, to be with you, to be with my teacher, my friend, my brother, Jim Lawson. My philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to say something, to do something. You cannot afford to be quiet. I think we're going to continue to go forward. These children, these young people, the women of America, but especially the young people going to get us there. I am very hopeful and very optimistic that these young people will be the leaders of the 21st century.
Reverend Lawson, seeing what we've witnessed, as Congressman Lewis said, these young people, the women, the young women on this stage today that are carrying the lessons that you taught Dr. King, that you taught Congressman Lewis, how does it make you feel to see those very tools that you came back with implemented?
You want me to speak the truth, or you just want me to talk?
The truth and nothing but the truth, so help us God.
Well, number one, I'm going to say, my observation is that most activism in the United States today is the activism of the USA and is largely cultural activism.
What do you mean by that?
I mean by that the lessons from the Rosa Parks-King movement, which is a separate entity from what's called the Civil Rights Movement, was a different kind of movement. It was a movement that recognized, in the first instance, that each one of us had power in the very gift of life, and that we had to use the gift of life, that's a precious gift from creation. We have to use that gift of life and exploit it on the noble sides of humanity, to learn to be as alive as we could become, to discover that with the gift of life is the gift of love, and that love is the energy of the universe and is the creative force of the universe, and that if we want to have a struggle, then movement must come out of that first. It cannot come out of a culture of violence. It cannot come out of a culture that has for too long pretended to be a land of the free and a home of the brave, while doing the most horrible kinds of things and developing a torturous history that has poisoned the airways in the United States in ways that we do not know. And then in addition to that, if we use a struggle that comes out of the gift of life, the gift of love, the gift of truth, that has to be essentially a nonviolent movement. And a nonviolent movement requires a sense of reason that says, if you want social change, you have to be and you have to do the things that produce social change. If you want justice, you must become just people. A struggle for justice must be itself a justice struggle. If you want freedom and access, then your movement must not reflect the enemies of human life, but must reflect equality and liberty and the dignity of all life.
Yes. And
so
Congressman
there's no alternative to that. You cannot overcome wrong with doing wrong. You cannot overcome evil with evil. As Gandhi said it very well in the words of Jesus, an eye for an eye, soon everyone is blind. A tooth for a tooth, soon everyone is blind. You can't get a new society by planting the seeds of the old society. If you want a new society, you have to plant the seeds that produces a new society. Jesus of Nazareth, and I say that name without all the dogma wrapped around him, insisted that you cannot get grapes from a briar bush.
Yes.
You have to get grapes from a grapevine.
So how do we today get that love, the resistance, the humanity back into the movement? I think if you'd ask anyone here, are they a just person, they would say yes.
One of the problems of our society is the fact that we are romantic of society. We think every generation is going to change us, but we mold every generation with straight up and down USA culture. So how do you get a new world from a new generation using the tactics of the society in which they live?
What is the answer, Congressman? What is the answer, Reverend Lawson?
The high school movement has a good beginning. That is, they know that enough is enough, and they want to see, they want to have the capacity of a society where they can operate learning across their years, especially as young people, in safety, without the violence, without the guns.
Congressman.
So that's a good goal.
Yes.
I like the goal.
Well, Jim Lawson has been my teacher.
Yes.
He's been my leader. When I was very young, had all my hair and a few pounds lighter, this man imbues me with the teaching of Jesus, the teaching of Gandhi. My advice for the young people today is to study the movement, read the literature, watch the films, the videos, and accept nonviolence as a way of life, as a way of living. When we were beaten, arrested, and jailed, we accepted it. During the 60s, I was beaten and left bloody, unconscious. I thought I was going to down that bridge. I thought I saw death during the Freedom Rise in 1961. When black people and white people can be seated together on a Greyhound bus or a Trailway bus, leaving Washington, D.C., to travel through Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. We were on our way to New Orleans. And Jim Lawson and others of us were arrested. We went to jail. More than 400 people, black and white, went to jail in Mississippi. But we didn't strike back. We didn't give up. We didn't give in. We kept the faith. And our action led to the desegregation of public transportation all across the American South. So when people say nothing has changed, I feel like saying, come and walk in my shoes. I will show you.
Yes. And those shoes are impossible to fill.
We're come a distance, but I agree with Jim. Somehow, in some way, we got to accept the way of peace, the way of love, the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence as a way of living, as a way of life. As a congressperson, I don't vote for military spending. We have enough bombs and missiles and guns to destroy this planet. We need to spend some of our limited resources on taking care of basic human needs.
When you hear from the young people who are on this stage, when you hear them, and I watch them come up to both of you asking to sit down and just provide them some advice. The blueprint hasn't changed. What worked 50 years ago can work today, but they feel under siege. You heard them say, you go on social media, they're attacked with words, not with sticks as you were, but still with a hostility that's defeating. How do they keep going? And how do they keep from feeling ignored when the cameras show up for predominantly white protests and their voices are deemed riots when they protest?
I've had an opportunity to meet with many of these young people, to march with them. When the student march took place in D.C. around our nation, in the city of Atlanta, they asked me to march with them. And the young man, a young student that introduced me, he said our next speaker was the youngest speaker on August 28, 1963. That's the March on Washington. And today, he's the oldest speaker. We have to identify with the hopes, the dreams, and aspiration of these young people. And let them lead. They will get us there.
Reverend Lawson, when they say, yes, they will, pass the torch to the next generation, what does that mean to you?
I didn't hear the first part of your...
When you hear people say it's time to pass the torch to the next generation, what does that mean to you? How is that done? Is that spending more time?
How is that done?
Yes, sir.
Well, one of the ways it's done is by young people putting themselves in a position where they can hear and feel and study and debate over some of these struggles. I have had the experience in the last 15 years of teaching undocumented students at University of California, Los Angeles, any number of whom, because of the sit-in campaigns of students, the Freedom Ride, and other such struggles, began to study and wrestle with them. And the DREAM Act people 10, 12 years ago began to organize, and they represent students, undocumented, who have taken hold of many of these ideas and disciplines and work, and created one of the important nonviolent struggles of the last 20 years. However, they've made a fatal mistake. That fatal mistake is that they listen to the pleas of their elders, not Kent Wong or Jim Lawson. They listened to the pleas of their elders who said, the way to get recognition and the legislation for undocumented people is to go to Congress and do it through Congress. And of course, Congress moves today all the time because of the thousands of lobbyists from the war industries, from the commercial industries, from Wall Street, from the Pentagon, from pharmaceutical agencies. So Congress can't hear the pleas of people because there are so many lobbyists who clutter up every congressional office. So if young people are going to get their attention, or if movement is going to get their attention, then you have to, in fact, create a struggle where today you put 1,000 or 2,000 people into the streets of Memphis or Washington, D.C., and next year you put 1 million. You interrupt the agenda of the status quo in such a fashion that they have to listen to a new agenda that are willing. They are busy with their own agenda. And nonviolent struggle around the world over the last 110 years has constantly put on the table the agenda of a new people, whether in Poland or South Africa, over and over again. They haven't gone to the governments and the legislators to do it. They have rather created their own demands, and then with the movement create the power that becomes a new entity in the mix. And that forces then the old powers to move over and to make adjustments and to make some changes. That's how we got all of the legislation of the 60s.
And here we are with a man who's been on both sides of that equation.
All the bills that people brag about, the media never, in celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Bill of 1965, never says that that wasn't on the mind of the president or the Congress or the lobbyists. But because of the Selma Montgomery March, because of the Freedom Summer, because of the Birmingham campaign, because of the Albany, Georgia movement, because of the Freedom Ride and the sit-in campaign, there was an awakening so that that bill could be passed.
Yes. And Congressman Lewis, you've been on both sides now. You've been the young person.
There isn't rocket science, but it is social science that Gandhi said is the only way to bring about social change of any kind of power or effectiveness. That's what King represents.
And Jim, some of the presidents that we had saw that. Lyndon Johnson said,
absolutely.
Lyndon Johnson said, if you want a voting rights act, make me do it.
Yes.
And we made him do it.
John Kennedy was asked by various people and organizations, including the Civil Rights Movement and the Parks-King movement, for a civil rights bill that was inclusive. He said it couldn't be done. But because of the Birmingham campaign and the Washington March, he changed his mind in less than four weeks. He changed his mind in less than 6 weeks and said and introduced a civil rights bill that is called the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. He said he was going to do it after he was reelected. But because of the campaigns in Birmingham and elsewhere, and there were more than 1,700 city demonstrations of different kinds, in addition to the Birmingham campaign and the Washington March. The net result was John Kennedy was persuaded to introduce the bill in 1963. That's power. That's power of the people.
Yes.
And it can happen again and again. And of course, Congress and the lobbyists and Bank America all try to persuade us to be conventional with the system that is. But the system that is fundamentally rotten. And a rotten system has to have some people who have the courage to say so and to organize to change the rot to rightness and maturity of spirituality and character that will allow the newness to emerge. I mean, that's the reality.
In addition, Cameron, we have to use the power of the vote. I've said on many occasions that the vote is the most powerful nonviolent instrument or tool we have in a democratic society, and we have to use it. And too many of us fail to use it. Now, you may recall, and Jim will recall, that the Democratic members of the House of Representatives wanted the Speaker of the House to bring forth a comprehensive bill to deal with gun violence, and he refused to do it. So we had a sit-in. My colleagues came to me and said, John, what should we do? We met in my office, and we planned and planned. We decided at a certain time, on a certain day, we would have a sit-in in the well of the House. The first time in the history of our country that members of Congress occupied the floor of the House for more than 26 hours. All Democratic members and almost every Democratic senator came over and joined us. And we may do it again. We may do it. Not just when it comes to gun violence, but we have more than 800,000 dreamers. These young people came here as little children. And we are not kind to them. We need to set them on a path to citizenship. And we may have to turn the Congress upside down and America upside down as Dr. King said, to set it right side up until we get action.
You've been on both sides. You've been the young person ready to turn Congress upside down, and now you're a member of Congress.
Well, since I've been in Congress, I've been arrested 5 times. And I'm probably going to get arrested again for something. and it's okay.
Yes.
And you go and you try to do everything in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion, but you have an obligation to disturb the order of things.
Do you see the frustration in the young people who are trying to figure it out, who know right from wrong, who know the injustices, whether it's the disproportionate number of black men who are incarcerated, the economic disparities, the game feeling like it is still heavily weighed against you, but not knowing, maybe it's through us not spreading the history in a way that connects, I don't know, that they can sustain the movement through the very plan that was put in place when you were a boy, getting advice from Reverend Lawson.
Well, when I was much younger, Jim was working with an organization called the Fellowship Reconciliation, and he had a little comic book.
The what?
You had a comic book.
Yeah.
That's Martin Luther King.
Montgomery bus boycott.
And the Montgomery story.
That's right.
And we read that little book.
That's right.
We digested.
That's right.
It taught us everything. Diane Nash will tell you, it prepared us, and we were ready. We were ready. We have been imbued. We were ready to march into hell's fire.
And that was one of the few pieces of material that we had relevant to the times in which we live, a comic book story of the Montgomery bus boycott. And I used it all over the South. I passed it out in my travels to my work in 58, 59, 60. And it told the story very effectively. And it told the story as an example of what nonviolent struggle can do. I want John and Tamarin to just inject something. That is to say that at this moment, we, the people of the United States, are headed towards re-electing Donald Trump because in 2020, the reason is that we are playing his game. And you know, that's where I think sports is such a great model for struggle, because no basketball team in the recent March Madness went onto the floor planning to play the opponent's game. The teams that came out on top and won the most victories during that whole month of March were the teams that went in on the floor geared to make the opponent play their game. You have to have respect for our opponents. And one of the ways you respect your opponent is that you know that the opponent plays his game better than you can play his game. And if you want to lose, you always play the opponent's game. If we, the people of USA, manage to elect a new president in 2020, it will be the accident of history and not the way in which we behaved in the last 4 years or today in 2018. We better find a different way of opposing all that Trumpism represents.
What do you see as the way? What is the game we should be playing?
Well, for an example, I don't watch a lot of TV news, but I do watch from time to time certain TV commentary shows. And for the last year and a half, or a year and 4 months, if you see a commentary film, commentators talking about any issue, over and over again, in the background is going to be a picture of President Trump. Almost all the time. The one I watch the most is MSNBC. I also watch occasionally CNN. Sometimes I switch back and forth when I'm going to do it. And all the time, they're reporting the news, and a picture of Trump is going to be in most of the TV pictures all the time. I know of no better way for him to be reelected than the news media to keep talking about any issue, and there's Trump in the picture. There he is. Every Twitter. Well, the media is going to reelect President Trump for the U.S. people by the way in which they report this time, at this moment, what's going on in our society. You mark my word. Mark my word.
Congressman Lewis, looking forward to the midterm elections, and no matter who ends up in control of Congress, the reality is the issues that face our communities, and what I mean by that, not just black people of color, people who live below the poverty line, people who are marginalized. How do they empower themselves no matter who is in control of Congress or who sits in the White House?
We have power, and we need to use the power. We need to use it. So many of our people of color, African American, Latinos, Asian American, Native American, hundreds and thousands and millions of whites, we have power, but we don't use it. And with social media today, we should be able to do more than we are doing. We hadn't heard of the internet. Facebook. What is that? And we had more than probably 500,000 people, maybe at the March on Washington in 1963. I think it was an undercount. It said 250,000. We didn't have social media when we marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. But we changed America. People couldn't stand to see people being beaten down. They couldn't stand to see people be trampled by horses, tear gas and bullwhips. So they changed. We have to create another powerful period of nonviolent direct action. And we can do it. I'm convinced we can do it. Put hundreds and thousands and millions of people in the streets. Why do we have all these members in Congress today deciding they're not going to run? The handwriting is on the wall. We're going to take the House of Representatives back, and if we work, we're going to take the Senate back. I'm going to work my butt off to see that it happens.
And Reverend Lawson, I'll give you the last word on this, as we may see a change in the makeup of Congress. Ultimately, what you started out the beginning of your message was humanity, finding that voice within all of us that can reach in a nonviolent way to affect change. You said to me, do you want me to tell you the truth? So I'll ask you today, do you believe that we are on the verge with the young people, with where we are we on the verge of recreating what you created 50 years ago?
No. Say it directly. We, the people of the USA, really do not have a political party. We may have bits and pieces here and there and yonder. I consider John one of my congresspeople and a number of others. We have bits and pieces, but we do not have a political party.
If we are to regain a political party that moves in the directions that the country was moving in, we, the people, are going to have to organize from a nonviolent perspective and create campaigns in city after city that helps to forge a new party, a new Democratic Party maybe, that will do our will, that will look to our interests. Look, sisters and brothers, Harvard University produced a study of the costs of the Iraq War. I think that report was issued about maybe 2 years ago. Harvard University study indicated we have spent $6 trillion for the Iraq War. $6 trillion for the Iraq War. Now, if we, the people, want Head Start and quality education for every boy, every girl, everywhere across our country, we're going to have to be in the streets to see to it that no more $6 trillion are going to be spent for war, but they're going to be spent on quality education, quality housing, on non-discriminatory economics, on the equality of economics across the board. I maintain that our present economic system is a plantation capitalist system, ideologically and structured. It is aimed at the gathering of wealth by the plantations. It is aimed at saying that working people, working families do not need to have sustainable incomes and steady and stable work. It says that they are more like slaves and do not deserve to have living wages. That's plantation capitalism. The fact that we have 160 million people at the bottom half of our population who do not have the wealth of the property of the 3 wealthiest men in the United States is in itself an indication that our economy is from top to bottom rotten. 160 million people do not deserve to be at the bottom of the ladder on food stamps and unable to support their children. Shelter insecurity, work insecurity, food insecurity, medical insecurity. That's the deliberate plan of the economy, though many of the decent people who are in that economy would say that's not what they wanted. But good intentions without good methods will lead to hell, not to heaven.
You asked for the truth, we got the truth. There you have it.
Good intentions is the road to hell, rather than the
there
road
you
to
have it, Congressman.
Good intentions have to have good ideology, good structures, good movements, good attitudes across the board. If they don't have them, we can't do it.
Before we turn it over to April for the next panel, I will ask Congressman Lewis to end it on this, which is where we started. Where do we go from here?
Well, I deeply believe and I feel that we can humanize America and create an America that is at peace with itself, where no one is left out or left behind because of their race or because of their color. But what we need in America is what I called back in the 60s a nonviolent revolution. A revolution of values, a revolution of ideas. I've said to people all the time that you must never get lost in a sea of despair. You have to continue to believe that we can do it, we can overcome. It may take a few days, maybe a few years, but we will get there, and I believe that. I've seen people who lived in fear. They were afraid, just living afraid. But I also have seen people grow up while they're sitting on lunch kind of stools, or while they are marching from Selma to Montgomery. And these same people or their children will lead us. They will help create the beloved community. But we must create a society that respects the dignity and the worth of every human being. And we don't do it with missiles and guns. We do it with teaching people to be human. Can we be a little more human? Can we just love everybody and not hate anybody? As Dr. King said, hate is too heavy a burden to bear. The way of love is much better for all of us. Thank you.
Let's again thank these great men for their wisdom then, their wisdom now, and their words that will live forever.
You want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered? YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so when we go live, you'll know it. You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.
Hey everybody, this is Sherry Shepherd. You're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered, and while he's doing Unfiltered, I'm practicing the wobble. Yes, I am. Because Roland Martin's the one, he will do it backwards, he will do it on the side. He messes everybody up when he gets into the wobble, because he doesn't know how to do it, so he does it backwards. And it just messes me up every single time. So I'm working on it. I got it. You got Roland Martin.
Hi, my name is LaToya Luckett, and you're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered.
What's going on, everybody? It's your boy, Mac Wiles, and you are watching Roland Martin Unfiltered.
What's up, y'all? It's Ryan Destiny, and you're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered.
What up, Lana Well, and you are watching Roland Martin Unfiltered.
Hey fam, want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered? The blackest show on all of digital, cable, and broadcast. Check out our audio podcast. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. Press play.